Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started now. I want to welcome everyone to another of our research methods and secondary data analysis seminar series. It's great to have you here in the room and also connected via video conference. And I want to remind you this is a regularly occurring monthly seminar on the first Thursdays of the month, and it's sponsored by the UAB MHRC, the UAB, or the Deep South RICMAR, which is the Resource Center for Minority Aging Research, the CORE, the Center for Outcomes and Effectiveness Research and Education, and also CCTS is now sponsoring it as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rob Weech-Maldonado, who will introduce our speaker.
Yes, hi everyone. Thanks, Ann. We're very pleased to have today Dr. Anthony Hood. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Strategic Management and Entrepreneurship at the School of Business. And Dr. Hood focuses on team science, team dynamics, looking at things like conflict, but also friendship, some positive things as well, right? And so he's also a member of the UAB group, big community?
One great community.
One great community. One great community. And also Center for the and he also mentors entrepreneurs through the UAB Innovation Lab. And he's also one of our scholars. So we're very pleased to have him present today. We're trying to have of our seminar series. So that Dr. Hood accepted our invitation today. You'll see, we do a lot of our presentations about usually our unit of analysis, the patient, maybe the provider, but this is things of looking at organizational dynamics, particularly from a team-based approach. So without further ado,
So good afternoon. So I'm going to be speaking today. I'm going to be just kind of introducing you guys to some of the research that I work on in the business school. In many ways, I'm really like an organizational psychologist. A lot of my research uses applied psychology, and we apply that wherever we find people that interact together, particularly those that interact across disciplinary silos. So some of my research looks at teams in student groups. Some looks at it in teams in software engineers. I'm also now starting to look at healthcare teams and teams of scientists. So I'm going to kind of introduce you to some of the things that we look at in our research. This is entitled Personality, Process, and Performance in Interprofessional Teams. I also want to acknowledge the CCTS, who has really supported me over the past year and a half and really encouraged me to kind of take my tools from the business school and start to play in the academic medical center sandbox. And so I've learned a lot, and I continue to learn a lot more about what happens in healthcare teams as well as in scientist teams. So the agenda today, I'm going to kind of go over the objectives. I'm going to give you a definition of teams because oftentimes we have different understandings of what exactly a team is. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the teams that I've the initiatives that are going on here at UAB that involve teams. And then I'm going to tell you about one of the recent studies that I have published in the Journal of Organizational Behavior, and then I'll entertain questions. Also, feel free to interrupt me at any time during my presentation if you have questions, or, I'm an academic, so I tend to throw around jargon and acronyms, so at any point I throw around something that you don't quite understand. Benefit of those who may not have come here, but maybe they just want to view the slides in PDF after the fact. So some of the slides I may gloss over just a little bit in the interest of time, but again, if I go too fast, just stop me and let me know. Okay, some of my objectives. Through this presentation, I want to kind of add to the pool of what we talk about when we mean evidence-based practice. I understand that evidence-based practice is, a real huge initiative, particularly in healthcare, when you think about clinical decision making. And so in the managerial field, we started to adopt some of what we've seen amongst our medicine colleagues and say, how do we adopt evidence-based practices as it relates to managerial decision-making, as well as preparing our students to be managers of for-profit, not-for-profit organizations, healthcare organizations, even universities. Also, I want to give you guys tools and resources through which that hopefully we can increase the comparability of the way that we measure interpersonal dynamics across contexts. And I'll get into that a little bit more. And then finally, give an overview of one of my studies. So, for those of you who are in the room, I'd just like to see a show of hands. How many of you guys actually teach using a team-based work? How many of you guys actually learn team-based work? How many of you deliver patient care as part of a team? How many of you working on grant submissions with other people? Also, are you working on publications with other people? I mean, you don't like some people you work with? Don't raise your hand. How many are involved in community-based participatory research? Patient-centered research? Or patient-centered care? Translational research. All right. So what I would argue is that, for the most part, most of us in this room are working in teams. It's probably very few of us here at UAB that are actually working in a solo job where nobody depends on your output and you don't depend on somebody else's output to get your job done. The National Academy of Science produced a report last year called Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science. What is the state of the art? What do we know from the scientific literature across a broad field of disciplines, whether it's business, psychology, healthcare, what have you, to get an understanding of what do we know about teams. And so the definition that they offer in that study is that a team is when you have two or more individuals with different roles and responsibilities who interact socially and interdependently. Somebody's output produces or creates within an organizational system, whether that's a learning organization, whether it's a healthcare organization, a for-profit organization, to perform tasks and accomplish common goals. Now, based on that definition, I would probably argue that most of us are working in teams either here at UAB or even outside of UAB, and maybe some of the service-related things that you're doing. So I think we all work in teams. Some of the things that we have here at UAB, how many of you guys have heard of our QEP, our Quality Enhancement Plan, that we're going to be pushing for accreditation and pushing for learning in a team environment? Raise your hands if you've heard of our QEP. If you haven't, you will. Because I think it's going to be infused across UAB. And so this Quality Enhancement Program is saying that we need to make sure that people leave here at UAB being able to work effectively and efficiently with other people, being able to recognize conflict, manage conflict, and engage interdisciplinary collaborations across disciplinary silos. I heard the Office of Interprofessional Simulation. Well, we have one of those here at UAB. I'm sure you'll probably be hearing a lot more about that, but the Office of OIPS does great work. They actually have simulated mannequins. They have a whole center, I think over in, I think it's Volcker Hall or Jefferson Tower, where they bring in healthcare professionals. You have nurses, doctors, residents, and they bring them in. They put them in a simulated environment, particularly when you think about non-routine types of situations where maybe a patient stops breathing. And so they present these workers with, a mannequin that has stopped breathing, and so they have to engage, communication actions in order to quickly revive the patient. And so that requires, knowledge, experience with working with people that oftentimes you may have never met before. On the floor at the hospital, there may be a code, and everybody on the floor needs to respond to that code. And when everybody responds, you have to make sure that you identify who has what expertise, make sure that roles and tasks are assigned, people assume responsibilities in order to make sure that patient care is maximized and quality. So, Office of Interprofessional Simulation is focused greatly on team-based care and learning. Also, they leverage what's called Team Steps. Team Steps is an initiative of ART, Team STEP stands for Strategies and Tools to Enhance Performance and Patient Safety. So this is something that's rolled out all across the country that teaches our healthcare workers how to work effectively in teams. And that's being implemented here at UAB. And also, how many of you guys have heard of team science? Team science is being pushed heavily by the National Institutes of Health. My understanding that much more of the grants going forward are going to be weighted based on the collaboration plans and the team science plans. So it's going to be more than just talking about whatever conflicts of interest that may occur or authorship on your grant proposals. They're going to want to know, how do you actually plan to have team meetings and work together across geographic boundaries? So there's going to be a lot more emphasis going forward on interdisciplinary collaboration. Hopefully that's what's going to advance science and discovery, because creativity and innovation occurs less so within disciplinary silos, but actually across disciplinary silos. So what happens if you bring somebody together from arts and sciences, with somebody from business, with somebody from engineering, with somebody from dentistry, and they work together on a project? That's probably going to be a very innovative product if they can speak the same language and not kill each other. Okay. So there's some definitions here of team science. I won't go through these definitions, but in essence, it's a team of people who are working together on scientific. So that's what they refer to as team science. There's also an initiative called the Science of Team Science, which is trying to create evidence-based curriculum around what we know and understand and what we need to know about how science works together. So some of the current trends in scientific research, as based on this report that I mentioned that was released last year, this report is very dense. I encourage you to pull it up one night and read it, but a person like me, a nerd that's about teams, I really enjoyed the report. But it's like 254 pages. And one of the things that stuck out to me is that they said, as of now, 90% of all science and engineering publications are authored by 2 or more authors. That's in stark contrast to maybe 30 years ago when most publications were solo authors. So now, in order for us to get grant proposals or to get the publications in our journal, we often take somebody that's specializing in the statistics, somebody else specializing in community-based research, somebody else specializing. It's very difficult these days to get the grant, to get the high-impact publications working alone. Oh, sure. And I have a pen on too. So. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So most publications are authored, as of now, about 6 to 10 authors, and most of those authors are geographically dispersed. So they are from different cities, different states, different countries in a lot of instances, and certainly across institutions. That creates huge challenges for working together effectively in teams, for people to become familiar with each other, to learn each other. And then this team size continues to increase. How many are working on projects with more than 5 people? More than 10? 15? Hey, how do you manage? All right. Do we need to do a
ask if they can you hear me on phone?
For this one?
Okay, so it's fading in and out. It's been for a while.
How about now?
Okay.
I'll just hold it. How about that?
Well, or maybe go on your shirt there.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So some of the challenges associated with team science, we just kind of went over a lot of that. It's high membership diversity, deep knowledge integration. How do you take somebody that has discipline expertise in strategic management with somebody else that does exercise science, with somebody else that does...
Right, so she needed to mute her microphone. That was feedback.
Okay.
But she disconnected, but maybe she'll connect back.
Okay, cool. All right. That's good. All right, so some of the recommendations that were made in this report is that we need to make sure that we're developing curriculum and training and opportunities for people to develop expertise and experience with developing what we call team mental models, which is something I'll talk about in a minute. What we call transactive memory. So it's the extent to which people develop a shared understanding of what other people know in their team, and they develop almost like a group level mental understanding of what they're working on. Also, they have cognitive team interaction, so people are able to anticipate what their team members are actually going to do in the future. And what about the team climate? Climate for diversity, climate for innovativeness and creativity, climate for speaking up. Also, psychological safety. This is the extent to which people feel comfortable admitting errors or asking for help. This is a huge thing, as I understand, in patient care, particularly when you have that different hierarchies, particularly within an operating room or within the field of care. Do lower tiered or people lower on the hierarchy feel comfortable speaking up when they see a practice that may be unsafe or detrimental to the patient? And what about team cohesion? So things like friendship, socializing outside of the workplace, those are things that we need to train people how to do and not leave it up to maybe the senior scientists or hopefully that people will just pick it up just for the simple fact that they're working together. Team efficacy, so this people's confidence in their ability to work together in teams. And also conflict. I won't ask you guys to raise your hand to find out how many people have conflict at work, but I'm assuming that there's probably some type of conflict that's occurring on your jobs. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about 3 of these things. It's transactive memory, team climate, and psychological safety. So I have actually provided, if you guys got the slides before this started, I provided you guys a resource. It's essentially a handout that kind of gives you an idea of some of the things that we draw on in the business field when we're studying teams. I'm going to pull it up on the screen. I'm assuming that you can't read this, but I'm going to tell you what's in it. You should have it if you've, I guess, and if they registered for it, they got these slides.
It actually went out to the email distribution list, so they should have it.
Okay, cool. So what I've provided in this document is really my cheat sheet. This is what I use when I'm doing my research or when I have researchers reach out to me and say, hey, Anthony, I have an opportunity to collect some data. I'm doing an engagement. Do you want to collaborate? I say, sure. They say, do you have any scales you want to throw in to this research? So this is kind of the cheat sheet that I use when I'm thinking about my collaborations. So first part of this is just kind of a list of some of the top journals in the field of business management and organizational sciences. So one of the things that I found difficult when I started collaborating with my colleagues on the health side of campus is that I didn't know which are the quote-unquote better journals and which were the lesser journals. Our impact factors may be on a different scale than impact factors on the health side of campus. So for me, having some type of cheat sheet would be helpful when I'm trying to bring myself up to speed on. So what's been done as far as team conflict in healthcare organizations or in educational settings. So for my colleagues, I'm providing you guys a list of some of the top journals in our field. And this list is by no means exhaustive, but at least it gives you somewhere to start if you want to kind of get a feel of what's the state of the art in business management. Also, I mentioned to you that evidence-based practice is something that's really picking up in the management field. So I provided some of the recent review articles that have covered, so how does evidence-based medicine translate to evidence-based management in the business field? So I've provided some citations for that. And then I've also provided several systematic reviews and meta-analytic reviews in the organizational sciences for those of you who may want to bring yourself up to speed on. So what do we know about creativity and innovation and its impact on team performance in business? Well, there's a publication. There was a journal article in the Journal of Business Venturing last year that looked at that. There's a meta-analysis that was produced last year that looked at the influence of cultural context on the relationship between gender diversity and team performance, a meta-analysis. So in the business fields, we've been actually studying teams for about 50 years, probably since the late 50s. So we have accumulated a large bank of evidence as it relates to how do you form good teams, what are the antecedents of effective team performance or the consequences of team performance. So one of the things that I want to encourage us in this presentation is that some of you will be called upon to maybe lead some type of effort in your division or in your department as it relates to teams. And the first thing you're going to think about is, okay, how do we measure conflict in teams or people's satisfaction working in teams. It would be easy to just try to make something up. But why not go to the evidence and find out what do we already know about this? Are there already psychometrically validated scales in the literature that we could possibly draw? Because that's going to increase the comparability of whatever finding that we may have. We can compare that to 50 years of research in the organizational fields. Now, granted, what we may know about software engineers may be totally different than what we know about biomedical engineers. But that adds to the body of knowledge. We can look at maybe some of the boundary conditions of, well, we observe this relationship between X and Y in this particular population, but maybe that operates differently in another population. That's going to add to the field. In addition to that, I've also added a lot of the scales that I use. All these scales have been psychometrically validated in the field, and I've also provided citations. So, for instance, Big Five personality. Big Five personality is something that we've been using for decades in psychology to understand people's different personality characteristics, whether they are high in conscientiousness or agreeableness or open to experience, or they're extroverted or introverted. It's interesting that when I'm in the business world, most of the business people prefer, and the consultants prefer, like Myers-Briggs and the DISC assessment, which arguably, if you ask psychologists, that stuff is not psychometrically valid. It always falls apart when you think about reliability. But businesses like it. They pay a lot of money to have consultants to come in. If a company paid me a lot of money to come in, I would probably use Myers-Briggs if they asked me to. However, I probably could not get that published in the Journal of Applied Psychology or an AMJ. So it's one of those things where evidence-based practice, do you do what you just have experience with, what you learned in graduate school, and does that really jive with what we understand as far as the evidence base? And so at some point, we have to make sure that what we're doing is based on, is informed by the evidence as well as our practical experience and things like that. And then towards the end of the document, I also have several of the actual scale items. Many of these scale items have 7 items, some of them have 3 items, some of them have 15 items. So you guys can check that out. You get back to your computers. And give me a call if you have any questions about any of the items, or if you need me to come in and maybe talk, maybe consult with you on measuring team dynamics of your organization or your division. Any questions? Cool. All right, so this guy right here is William Edwards Deming. He was, one of his claim to fame is the Toyota manufacturing system. I think he went over to Japan and really kind of helped them put a lot of their process improvements in place, and that's how a lot of the Asian car manufacturers really became into dominance. But one of his, one quote that's famously attributed to him is that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And again, oftentimes we are trying to manage teams and interprofessional collaborations in our organization, but how are we measuring it? And if we're not measuring it, it's going to be exceedingly difficult to manage it. So where do we stand? How frequently are we actually assessing the teams and the intercollaborations that we have in our organizations? What instruments are we using? And are those instruments based on the evidence base? How are we actually using those results to enhance effectiveness? It's probably nothing worse than when we go out, do some surveys, we collect data, and then we don't report back to the employees or the students as far as what we collected and how we can use those to, make the workplace a better place. So it's one of those things that we always have to keep in mind as to when we actually do collect data, what's the end result and how we're going to translate that into performance. And then what are the best practices? Okay, so enough about that. I'm going to now get into one of the studies that I recently had published in the Journal of Organizational Behavior. This was done with several of my colleagues at University of Alabama, California State, and Emory University. Actually, Elliott is now at Ohio State University. But the title is called Mediating Effects of Psychological Safety in the Relationship Between Team Affectivity and Transactive Memory Systems. I know it's a mouthful. I'm sure you guys are used to these long titles in your science. But I'm a pictures guy, so I like pictures. Excuse me. So here's a pretty picture. This is our figure 1 in our proposal. So what we were interested in is the extent to which people within teams can develop an effective means of working together. And oftentimes team effectiveness is based on our ability to learn what other people know within our teams. And so this phenomenon of transactive memory systems, that's our dependent variable in this study, captures learning. Also what captures learning is this construct of psychological safety, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But psychological safety is the extent to which we create a climate in our teams that people feel comfortable taking interpersonal risks. Interpersonal risks like speaking up, making mistakes, and then admitting to their mistakes. And then positive and negative affectivity, in many ways, is like a personality variable. It's what we call an individual difference variable, that people may have a tendency to be high in positive affect. That means that they are very sensitive and respondent to things like rewards, positive information, versus people who may be high in negative affectivity. They may have a tendency to be very reactive and very attentive to negative things. Like you say one thing bad, you make one mistake, and they ruminate over it, never let you forget about it. I'm not going to ask how many people work with people. You probably could readily identify some people in your teams that are either high in positive affectivity, or low in positive affectivity, or high in negative affectivity, or low in negative affectivity. Also think about, where do you lie? You know, are you more optimistic and cheerful, or are you more kind of pessimistic? You kind of look for what could go wrong as opposed to what could go right. And so what our research shows that within teams, it matters the extent to which you have a preponderance of negative affectivity or positive affectivity. These things have an impact on team learning and team performance. So let's start with our dependent variables, transactive memory system. So again, this transactive memory system was studied by a gentleman named Daniel Wick, I think back in the mid-1980s. He was interested in looking at strangers versus dyads of couples, intimate couples. So what he wanted to understand is, do pairs of intimate couples versus pairs of strangers, which one outperform each other on memory tasks? And so what he found is that intimate couples always outperform strangers on memory tasks. And so, you know, through these experimental designs, what he found is that intimate couples have this cognitive scaffolding where one partner is likely to know what their other partner is likely to forget. And so if given like a list of words to remember, if you give you 50 words to remember, sit the couples down, give them the same list of 50 words, sit the strangers down, same 50 words. When you bring them back together as a couple, the intimate couples always remember more words than the strangers. So what happens is that I know what my wife is likely to forget. And so because of that, I'm going to expend more of my cognitive resources focusing on what she's going to forget and less on what I already know. So for instance, I may be really good with remembering people's birthdays, but I have no idea what the stamps and envelopes are at my house. Conversely, my wife knows everything is in the house, but she can't remember birthdays. So collectively, we can achieve the shared task of making sure that everybody in the network receives a birthday card on their birthday if we work together. Oftentimes, strangers don't have this cognitive scaffolding where they understand what their partner's memory strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and as a result, their memory performance is hindered. Now, translate that to the projects that you're working on, whether you're working in healthcare or working on science projects. How well do you understand the strengths of the people that you're working with versus the weaknesses? At the extent to which you believe that your partner has weaknesses, you're going to spend more of your time trying to remember your own stuff as well as their stuff because you don't trust them to remember these things they say that they're supposed to be an expert in. And so what happens is that if you don't have a well-efficient transactive memory system, it increases what we call the cognitive burden of everybody on the team. So that therefore will become stressed out, emotionally exhausted at work. So again, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but how many of you have been working with your team, and John says that he's an expert in X, and then when it came time for John to recall X or use X on your team project, he didn't, do what he said he was supposed to do. Going forward, now you feel compelled to remember things as it relates to X and not trust John in that area, which increases your cognitive and now you're ticked off with your team members because you feel like you're overworked and underpaid. Okay? So, how do we begin to train our scientists, our researchers, as well as our students on how to recognize people's expertise and how to start having conversations about who should know what and remember what in our teams? I teach a strategic management class to undergraduate seniors. They're in their last semester. It is an interdisciplinary course, so I have students from accounting, finance, human resources, information systems, econ, management, all disciplines in the business school, and occasionally I have students from liberal arts and elsewise taking my class. So I've toured around every semester since I've been. This is my 5th year. It seems like every semester I try some different type of way of forming the teams. I usually form teams the first week of class, and then they perform in these teams throughout the entire semester, and they work on a semester-long capstone project. It's usually an analysis of some organization here locally or maybe some Fortune 500 company that they have to do research on. And let me tell you, you get a team of accountants together with HRs, with technology students, with liberal arts, it is difficult, particularly in the beginning. And I intentionally make first team submission due 2 weeks into the semester. And oftentimes the students complain like, Dr. Good, you haven't given us a time to actually form together in teams. But when you get in the real world, how many of you guys have been just kind of thrown into a team and expect to work immediately? You know, so this is kind of a real world preview of my students as to how do you quickly begin to develop cadence amongst your group members. The flip side is I've also tried to say, okay, you know what? I'm going to put all the accountants on the team together, all the HR people on the team together, and that fails too, right? Because everybody sees the world through their own lens, and so the accounting students focus on just the accounting aspects of the team. They totally gloss over all the things that relates to people. Like you have to actually account for people and not just, and I want to call bean counters. You know, that's one of the derogatories we have for accountants. And vice versa. Oftentimes, the HR students are thinking about the people, but they don't think about the cost that you have to incur in order to make sure that the workplace is a good place for everybody. Okay? So, this transactive memory system construct is what Wegner describes as a social network of individual minds that within the team, some of you are on teams of 5 people, 10 people, some of you raise your hand and you're on a team of 15 people. You essentially have a social network, and each one of your minds are linked by connection. And through those connections, you guys engage in what we call transact. That's where the transactive comes in memory. Your memories are linked through the transaction that you have. That's your communication, your interactions. Even if those communication and interactions are what we call digitally mediated. That means you're communicating through the internet or through telephone. You're still by this social network. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. All right. So I apologize, maybe a little bit too small for you to see. But what I want to express to you in this chart is this is a simplified representation of how your mind works, particularly when you're working on a team. So in these columns, you have an understanding of what tasks need to be done for your projects, what expertise is needed in order to complete those tasks, and which people have what expertise in order to perform which tasks. Now, some of you probably have gaps in your cognitive understanding of the associations across the roles as it relates to the tasks, the expertise, and the people. For instance, Susan, you may know that Susan is on your team. You may know that Susan has been assigned the task of framing the theory paper, but you are unclear about Susan's actual expertise in theory framing. So you just have to trust that Susan can do what she has been assigned to do. Now, you may be working on a project that you know is going to require multi-level analysis, and you know that it's going to require somebody that has expertise in methods, probably a statistician. But perhaps you don't know a statistician. You got problems. You got to find somebody that has this expertise and that can perform these tasks. Now, you may have Steve on your team, and you know that Steve has expertise in teams, but what if the project doesn't actually really call for a team-based contribution to the project? Then it may leave you wondering, why is Steve actually on the team? I don't understand what Steve is doing. Not Steve Yoder. It just happened to be. It's a deal. So, this is what happened when I put my students in teams the first day, right? This is probably blank. This is a blank canvas unless they work with other students before, project, which some semesters I say, you know what, I'll let you form your own teams. And what happens is that friends get on a team together, and then oftentimes that's a mess going somewhere to happen too. So again, I don't know what the best practices are. I'm still trying to figure it out. Probably I need to the evidence base to figure out what's the best way to actually form student teams in order to maximize effectiveness. So when I actually do my hands-on workshops, I actually provide our participants actual blank copies of this, and I sit them down and say, okay, think about, let's get in mind one project we're working on, and let's fill this out. And what's really interesting is that when I can bring the entire team together, and I give each team member one of these, but I don't let them share. I say, okay, I'm going to give you 10 minutes, everybody fills this out, and then I'm working together. Guess what happens? Everybody has a different understanding of who's supposed to do what on the team. And so what happens is that we have this social networks of individual minds, but there's no convergence around who is supposed to do what and who has what expertise. And don't start bringing in the whole thing about the shared vision and the shared goal. Why are we doing this project at the beginning? So this is what we oftentimes take entrepreneurs through, and we're mentoring them at the Innovation Depot. We actually have to sit down and kind of think through, what are you actually working on? Why are you working on it? Who's missing on the team? And how do you actually go out to recruit new people to come onto your team in order to share the cognitive burden of processing information for your team projects? So the extent to which we can develop a trust and we begin to learn what other people know within our team is based on, A, our awareness of the location of expertise within a team. You may know that there's a particular level of expertise within your team. Somebody knows how to do hierarchical linear modeling, but you don't know where that expertise is actually located. That oftentimes happens as the team size gets bigger. Some of you who are working in teams of 10 to 15 people, and they're composed of people across different institutions, you need to know where to find information. And you may struggle. If you don't have some type of central database that can help you make sure that you're locating that information, you're going to struggle. Also, you may know where expertise is, but you actually value that expertise that other people have. And I think oftentimes we struggle with this when interprofessional teams, is that we think that our expertise and our brand is more important than everybody else on the team. So how do we make sure that we have healthy appreciation of what other people on the team bring to the table? Because if not, you're going to shut other people down, and then you're going to push them out of the team. Also, you need to understand the relevance of other people's expertise as it relates to what you're working on in a team environment. Now, you may know where expertise is. You may value somebody, you may highly value somebody's expertise. That doesn't mean that you're able to access it. I find this oftentimes in my student teams, particularly now teaching an online version of strategic management. So oftentimes I have students come to me complaints like, Dr. Hood, we need to kick Bob off the team because he never comes to the team meetings. Say, well, John, you do know this is an online class, right? Well, yeah, but we still need to meet at Starbucks at 5 Point South, and Bob never gets. But it's an online class. There's no expectation that Bob has to actually meet with you face to face. And as a matter of fact, Bob has said, I would be happy to meet with you via Google Hangout, through conference call. So, oftentimes in teams, we struggle with accessibility. We also struggle with the cost associated with seeking somebody else's information. So, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but how many times have you experienced, you know what, I know that John has expertise I need, but every time I ask John for expertise, I have to spend 45 minutes at his desk listening to his aches and pains and how his wife gets on his nerves and his kids hate him. Sometimes people drag you down. And so you count the cost of, you know what, is it even worth it going national? It happens, right? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but it happens. Or what if it just takes a long time to get things back from people? Like, you need an answer in 5 minutes, and there's some person that it usually takes them 24 hours to respond to you. You don't have that type of time. So what you end up doing is going to somebody who has lesser expertise, but that person is more convenient to you and more accessible. And so for you, the benefits outweigh the costs. That would cause problems working in teams when we're actually circumventing the team's stated expert because of whatever reason. We don't like them, we're having conflict, or that person dragged me down when I go and talk to them. You guys laugh talk about people dragging you down, but those people who may be high in negative affectivity, they just have an individual difference or a tendency to kind of see the glass half full, whereas other people may tend to see the glass, half empty, or vice versa. I think I said that wrong. All right. Also, okay, sorry about that. The cursor.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm moving. Is that distracting? I'm sorry. I'll stop doing that. I was fidgeting. I'm sorry. That's better than pacing. I was telling Ann, I said, Ann, I'm a pacer, right? She's like, well, I got this camera on you, so you need to stay put. So this is my nervous kind of twitch. That's when I'm moving my hand. All right. So. So another aspect when you think about psychological safety is the extent to which people within our team feel comfortable admitting errors. Hey guys, I made a mistake. We submitted this paper to a journal. The reviewers came back. It's like, I don't know how you got the numbers, and you go back and rerun the numbers and realize, oh shoot, I made a mistake. Do you say the reviewers are just idiots? Or do you own up to it like, you know what, I totally miscalculated that. They're right. It's my fault. What are the consequences for that? There are sometimes some teams where you make that kind of mistake and you're not being invited back to work on future projects with that team. And so if that's the kind of environment you have, people will have a tendency to hide their errors and not admit them. How do we create an environment where people feel comfortable doing that? How do we create an environment where people feel comfortable asking for help without feeling like people think that you're, incompetent? But maybe you found yourself in an environment where you just know you can't go ask for help, or maybe you go ask for help from somebody outside the team because you don't want to admit that, hey, you're struggling with something. Is there a comfort level in your team to actually challenge other people's ideas, their opinions, maybe the decisions or the alternatives that maybe they've advanced as you're working on a project? Is that frowned? Is there some type of, I've read some of the healthcare journals where it talks about the hidden curriculum as it relates to medical education, where oftentimes you know that there may be somebody that's senior on your team, and it may be a bad career to actually make Dr. Such look bad in front of the team. But what if Dr. Such is engaging in a practice that's going to compromise the patient's health? Do you speak up about that, or do you keep it to yourself? And so the literature is full of examples, things like the Challenger crash, or there are a number of airplanes that have actually crashed on the side of mountains because of the culture in which it was frowned upon for junior pilot to say to the senior pilot, I think we're about to fly into a side of a mountain. This is serious. You can't make this stuff up. This is actually some type of cultural things that create the psychological unsafe environment where you can't challenge, question, or vet the ideas of other people. And if you do, is there a threat that you might be punished or sanctioned? I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit. And so I kind of talked about the individuals that may be high in negative affectivity or individuals that may be high in positive affectivity. And just to be clear, these are not two sides of the same coin. You can be high in positive affectivity or low positive affectivity. And you can be high in negative affectivity or low in negative affectivity. You can be high in both, you can be low in both, you can have a mix of both. So these are two different types of constructs. And so we measure differently as well. So people who are high in negative affect, they may be more prone to self-doubt. They may actually have expertise, but they always offer a caveat whenever they declare their expertise within a group environment. And so when they have self-doubts, it creates doubts in the minds of their team members as it relates to their abilities to actually perform well in the team. They may be more likely to experience stress, particularly in group environments. And they may be more sensitive to perception of unfairness within the team. So they may be very sensitive to, my resources, am I getting the right authorship, things like that. Contrast that with people who are in high and positive affectivity, they're more likely to seek rewards, whereas people who are high in negative affectivity, they may be more likely to All right. So going back to our conceptual model, this is what we're studying, and we actually collected data to actually study this particular model. So what we did, we collected data within a data set. We had 107 technology implementation teams. These were actually software engineers. One of our colleagues was actually doing some training for the Project Management Institute. So we had this huge access to these, dozens of software teams. So we went to the evidence base, we collected some scales, we found some theories that we wanted to use, we constructed a conceptual model, collected this data, and then from this data, we measured this study. So we had 519 members, 107 teams. We did it in a lagged study. So we collected the individual different variables first. That's the affectivity. Then secondly, we collected the psychological safety, and then at the end, we collected transactive memory systems. So that gave us some kind of assurance as to the causality, that the actual positive affectivity kind of led to the psychological safety, which led to transactive memory systems. That's necessarily imperfect, but it's better than just a cross-section design in which we would collect all the data at one time and then analyze it. These are the scales that we used. There's an actual scale called PANIS. It's the positive negative affectivity schedule, psychological safety, and then transactive memory systems. So what did we find? And I'll kind of just skip ahead to the conceptual model. The red arrows indicate where we had non-significant findings, and the green arrows are the significant findings. So what we found was that negative affectivity had a dampening effect on psychological safety. That's to the extent to which, within a team, if you have a preponderance of individuals that are high in negative affectivity, you're going to create a psychologically unsafe environment for interpersonal learning, for risk-taking. And ultimately, having lower levels of psychological safety leads to lower levels of transactive memory systems development, which ultimately has a dampening effect on team effectiveness. We found that there was no relationship between positive affectivity and psychological safety. So that means that even if you have a team full of people who are high in positive affectivity, they don't necessarily create a psychologically safe team environment. And then ultimately, there's no mediating effects of psychological safety on the relationship between positive affectivity and TMS. We ran mediation analysis, and we did find that psychological safety mediated the relationship between negative affectivity and transactive memory. So it's actually psychological safety acts as an explanatory mechanism for why negative affectivity has this effect on transactive memory systems. What does this mean? And what do we take? Well, the implications are learning in team environments, that is, learning who knows what, learning people's strengths and weaknesses, and being able to develop a well-coordinated machine in your teams is influenced by how we structure the teams. It means that we probably need to pay attention to the actual personality types and the individual tendencies that individuals have in the team. Now, that does create challenges because oftentimes, so before I came to academia, I worked for 10 years at AT&T. So I went through all types of professional development training and that kind of stuff. We did the DISC assessments and things like that. And oftentimes we report out on what our psychological personality trait was, or I'm a high D or I'm a low C. And that's when people start putting labels on people. And sometimes that can be unfair because sometimes your personality is sometimes dependent on the context. Whereas I may be a high driver when I'm at work, when I get home, my wife is a driver, and I just kind of take a back seat. Or maybe I am a high driver amongst my friends, but less so in other environments. And so once we start putting labels on people, it's hard to kind of break out the box. And now we start saying, well, Ann is going to be this way, and so I'm not going to approach Ann for such and so forth. So we have to approach this very carefully when we start analyzing people's personalities within the workplace. But what we can do is make sure that we're creating curriculum and creating environments where people can actually practice and simulate psychological safety. So that's one of the things that Marjorie B. White does in the Office of Professional Simulation, is that they have these training courses where you do role playing, create psychological safe environments, or you play the Confederate where you're creating a psychologically unsafe environment. And so how do you change that type of team environment? So these are the type of programs we need going forward if we want to make sure that we're creating very effective interprofessional teams. And so I'll end with this. I know we have probably about 20 more minutes left, and I would love to engage in maybe some conversation around this topic, but Peter Drucker echoed what Edward Denny says, that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so if we really manage the dynamics in our teams, we have to make sure that we measure that on a consistent basis, and then we're using those findings in order to engage in interventions that makes the workplace a more productive environment and a psychologically safe environment for all involved. So we have 2 minutes. What question? Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, in your opinion, is there ever a team size too big where there's too many levels, too many, I guess, hierarchies or levels of interaction where it would not, I guess, benefit? Is there like a sort of an optimum team size for different, I guess, scopes of projects?
Yeah, so in the literature, we're still trying to figure that out. And then you start adding in these other nuances when you have these larger teams, and to what extent are they geographically dispersed? And then what are the boundary conditions? So do we have good technological tools in order to make sure that people can interact either synchronously, which means that we have this very rich interaction, it's real time, or is it asynchronous? And so that's one of the things that I'm really kind of learning in my class of teaching with strategic management. Much of our interactions are asynchronous. And so while I'm sitting here, I'm sure I had some students post some type of question on our discussion board that after this I'm going to respond to them. So what impact does that have on communication compared to when we actually work in the same environment across each other in the same workplace? So I think we're still trying to figure that out. My sense is the larger the team, the lower the performance.
Anthony, just, I guess, a couple of questions. One of them is more about the method. So how did you test for the mediation?
So we use this macro called process that was developed by Hayes, as in Preacher and Hayes. Mm-hmm. So it's a macro that overlays SPSS. So initially we do the Barron and Kennedy 3-step model where we look at this stepwise, see if there's significance and whether the IB and the DV reduces in significance in the presence of the mediator. But then to test the extent to which that mediation is significant, we use a process macro. So the process macro gives us a confidence interval based on whether there's mediation or not. Okay. And that's referred to the Sobel test that we've been kind of using for a number of years.
So the criticism of the Kenny and Barron, right, that it doesn't happen. So you know that component. Okay, good. Yeah. The other thing is, I guess, theoretically, you mentioned about the transactive memory. So how do you relate that to performance, and maybe specifically like in the healthcare environment, where it would be more about the patient outcome, or something more concrete, in terms of what happens in healthcare? How do you see all of that connected?
Right. So that's something that we're learning right now. So I'm actually working on 2 exciting projects. I'm working on a project we have like the second, I guess you call it second round review at NASA, where we're actually trying to study transactive memory systems amongst astronauts that are engaging in long-distance exploratory missions, i.e. missions to Mars. And so, if you're in a land environment, if Rob and I have conflict, then at the end of the day, I go to my respective corner, you go to your respective corner. When you're on a mission to Mars, it's going to be several years. Number one, how long does it take you to actually develop a transactive memory system? And number 2, what happens when people can't retreat? So those are the things that we're still trying to figure out in that kind of environment. I'm also working on a project for the Department of Defense. So we also have a subsequent review with the Department of Defense where we're looking at in what we call STAT. So STAT is an acronym, STAT, Swift Starting Action Team. So what happens in the theater of combat where maybe you have 2 different squadrons that are brought together very quickly, where people don't even know each other. They have to quickly start working together, and they have a critical task that they have to perform. Well, that happens in healthcare all the time. Again, when you have one of these codes where you have people that have to respond to this code, how do you develop a transactive memory system? You know, so when Rick original research, he says, well, okay, intimate couples, because they're around each other, they have the benefit of communicating very frequently, they maybe even live together, yeah, they can develop transactive memory systems. But what about people who don't have that type of luxury? How do we help that develop? And so that's an area of research that is only now starting to burgeon in the healthcare field. So my sense is, can we create some type of mechanism to where people can quickly at least ascribe expertise to somebody when they're responding? So my understanding is now in some places at UAB, different healthcare workers wear different color scrubs. So I quick, you're nodding your head. You want to speak to that maybe? Yes.
Yeah, so
Color scrub, lady?
I just came from pharmacy in July.
Okay.
And so pharmacy wears wine scrub.
Okay.
Nurses, I guess just regular RNs wear navy blue. Nurse practitioners wear like a teal blue. So, you know, they said it was due to kind of patient care and reporting back, because so many people come in your room and ask for this and poke you and do this. So if you say, well, somebody said they were coming back at so-and-so time and it's past that time, where are they at? Oh, well, what was their name? I don't know, I didn't read their badge, but what color scrub were they wearing?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they were wearing teal. Okay, that was somebody from this so-and-so, you know, for follow-up and things like that. That's what they said. And then they said years ago at UAB it was like that, but then they relaxed it, and so it goes back and forth. But
right. So based on the color scrub or maybe what people are wearing, you have an expectation that that's the pharmacist. That person knows which drugs that we need in order to revive the patient. And so we ascribe expertise based on what we call superficial characteristics, which oftentimes that can be wrong. What happens when you're wrong? And a mistake. Okay, so again, we're still trying to figure out how can we take what we know from the business disciplines and psychology and apply that to healthcare. I know some, David, I guess it's been, 2 years ago, when this was just a working paper, I asked David Rogers to read it for me, and he was like, this is good stuff. We need to understand this, particularly like in operating rooms. David, I hate to put you on the spot. I know this is something that you and I discussed maybe a year or so ago.
No, I think in the state of healthcare, we're actually, we use the word team to all of our groupings. So where we really are is we don't even know how to describe how we work together. Because in a code, which is a situation where someone is at jeopardy of dying or is newly deceased, a group of people will run to that person who are having to introduce themselves to each other, right? So I don't think in any team definition you would call that a team.
Right.
So we do these things, these sort of proxies where we say, well, what is your professional role? Well, even if you say I'm the respiratory therapist and I'm responsible for obtaining an airway, I don't know your capacity.
Yep.
I don't know your integrity.
Yep.
I have to make a series of assumptions around that. So I think that before we can, like team steps and crew resource management, the problem is if you take an airplane and say, is that like a healthcare team? Only if team members can parachute on and off the plane as it's in flight. Mm-hmm. Because that's how it works in healthcare. So I think that some of these fundamental processes we need to understand, because I think in a primary care setting or in a research setting, that probably can become a real team.
Yeah.
But in what I do in an operating room, some days I'm in a team, some days I'm not. Some days I'll start in a team and that will evolve into a group because all that composition changes. So it's a really complicated circumstance to begin to wrap your head around. So.
Right. And sometimes you may have to make an executive decision on something, right? Particularly if it's something that's non-routine or complex.
Reading about entrustment because I got interested in these models of how does trust form in a regular team, I think are pretty well established. But the best analogy was cab drivers, actually. And I never thought about this because when I go to get a cab, that's a person in a big yellow car, right? So I know that's a cab, and that theoretically is a cab driver. because why else would he have a yellow car? What the cab driver is having to decide is, do they want to let me in their cab? And so they're making judgments. So there was a great study that said that if you're close to a place of worship and hail a cab, you're more likely to be picked up, regardless of race or gender, than if you're just walking around on the street. Because they're going to make assumptions. Hey, must be a honest person. Wow, so they be hanging around the place of worship. So these notions of how do I develop trust, or is that even trust, very acutely to me is interesting. And that's an area in healthcare where we are going to have to work unless we fundamentally change how we do healthcare.
Right. And then there are different types of trust. So when you start unpacking what is trust, you may have trust in somebody's expertise, but you don't trust them personally. You don't trust kids. So we have what's called affective trust versus cognitive trust. And so those things matter. In the same way, we have different types of conflict. So you may have conflict over ideas, but they're not personal. You may have other conflicts that are personal and may think I'm a jerk. That's a personal conflict. But you may trust my expertise. Or you maybe have process conflicts where, we have conflict over actual resources or, things like that in our work. So helping understand the different types of conflicts is going to be key in order to make sure that you can actually resolve the conflicts. Because if you can't accurately diagnose, if you will, the conflict, then you can't actually resolve the conflict. So that has implications also for transactive memory. Yeah.
Do you have any plans to, parlay this research into research teams? That was, we're sharing a brain today. But seriously, because many of us identify ourselves as working on pretty big teams, and all of our teams are made up of folks with various expertise and experience, and you touched on things like value and relevance, and I don't know that all of our teams really understand the implications of any of the information that you shared with us today, whether it's in a smaller context or a larger context. So I'm interested in knowing, in academia, what does it mean to develop a team and maintain that team, but also to ensure that your team is getting to a point where they've developed that transactive memory, so an efficient one, and so that your team can be more effective.
Yeah, I hate to keep saying it, but we're still trying to figure it out. So, like I mentioned, I acknowledge the CCTS. The CCTS had me go to the NIH last summer to a Science of Team Science conference. And so this was a lot of the trainers and administrators at the NIH and other universities that had responsibility for overseeing research teams, science teams, and grants. And it was clear to me that nobody really had best practice. We were all still trying to figure out, what are you guys doing? A lot of it has to do with promotion and tenure expectations. So we tell people we want them to work together in teams, but in order to get promotion and tenure, you have to establish yourself as an independent researcher, which oftentimes is interpreted as you need to be able to work together by yourself, independently, and get your own grant funding without the assistance of other people, or you have to be the lead author. And so sometimes you have these messages that create, these challenges for advancing science, as well as making sure that people make it through the promotion and tenure pipeline. And also, they're competing goals across different academic teams. So in some departments, some researchers are more interested in writing books because that's how their promotion and tenure is based. Or other people are interested in getting their own independent funding, where in my department, it's 5 peer-reviewed journals in 5 years, but you got to get some top hits. So I come to a team, oftentimes, particularly with my health colleagues, they say, Anthony, I would love to collaborate, but I don't have any money. And oftentimes I'm like, well, I don't necessarily need the money, I just want the publications. Like, you work for free? I'm not working for free. The same, my promotion and tenure is based a little bit differently than your promotion and tenure. So how do we create the environment in which we can start having conversations so that we can develop appreciation, not only of other people's expertise, but what they want to get out of the actual collaboration. And so, again, I think these are things that we're still trying to figure out. There's another Science of Team Science conference that's coming up this year. I'm going to go to it. And so I'm going to be listening tentatively about how do we actually develop stuff real time that's relevant to people. I think another criticism for particularly my field, and maybe all of our fields, is that we do science, for the sake of science, right? I publish this paper in the Journal of Organizational Behavior, that's great. Now I'm off to the next publication. How do I then start translating that into actual educational intervention where we actually teach people why this is important? How do I take this and train my students how to quickly develop a transactive memory system or to identify people's individual tendencies? But oftentimes that's not rewarded. So what we're learning from the NIH perspective is that we need to make sure that from an institutional level, we are putting our money where our mouth is and actually making money available and changing the promotion and tenure process such that it actually rewards and facilitates effective team science. Yeah.
And from the NIH perspective, one of the things that's really popular now is climbing these TCCs, the Transdisciplinary Collaborative Center.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a perfect lab for what it is that you guys do.
Right.
And there are several of them that involve different institutions, community organizations, all that. And I often wonder if there's anyone that's doing what it is that you do, because that's such a key part to the success of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of that goes into it. They tell you to work together, work with these institutions and do that. And then I wonder who's in the background, who has your expertise that's observing whether or not this actually is a good idea and they're able to be more effective as a team than working individually in institutions.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. And I'm starting to be okay with saying I don't know because I think we have a psychologically safe environment where I feel comfortable telling you I don't know. One of the things I found interesting when I went to the NIH and, it's a huge room with hundreds of folks in the room, and I would ask these questions and everybody would look at me funny like, who is that guy? And then, you introduce yourself like, hey, my name is Anthony Hood, I'm classical business and UAB is like, you're in business, why are you here? I get that a lot. I get that here at UAB a lot too. Sometimes people don't say it because they're nice, but I can see it like, why is the business guy here? So, yes, there are people in my field that are doing this, but oftentimes we're doing it in much more of the for-profit types of organizations, and we're not taking what we understand from business or management or organizational psychology and looking to see what does that look like in science teams or in health teams. So we have to create that environment where we can translate and transport what from one silo to the other. We have a hand back here, I think. Yeah.
I had a question. In your model where you had the relationship between negativity, psychological safety, transactive memory, I mean, you simplified that, but it would seem to me that there would be other confounders or mediators such as the age. You have a heterogeneity in the group composition, so age, gender, their cultural biases. So did you look at other things that might be affecting that relationship besides the main hypothesis?
Yeah, I did simplify, but we did control for gender diversity. I think we controlled for age diversity in team as well. Okay. I think we may have controlled for conflict as well. So I think we may have had like 4 or 5 covariates in the model.
And so when you say you controlled, I mean, you had a large sample size. Of course, I'm speaking as a standard. Relatively, because as someone mentioned here, we have these large groups we work on, but we have no way to control group membership if it's a large project. They're just in it. So we don't select the group members. And we also don't select the group leader at any time. So sometimes there's a lot of dissension about who's leading the group, whether they should be the leader.
Yeah.
So is that how your research is? It's dynamic. You deal with the groups, in other words, just as they exist. I mean, like if you were to come do this study, the group composition is already predetermined.
Mm-hmm. So in this particular study, the teams were already intact, but I'm assuming they were intact because management said you're going to work together.
Right.
So they were already intact teams, which it seems like that's oftentimes different in academic medical center because oftentimes we do have the autonomy to say, hey, Rob, can I work with you on a project? And then Rob and I work together on a project. It's not like Rob's boss says, hey, you and Anthony are going to work together. So we do have some level of autonomy. I do have some publications that's looking at student teams. Yeah. But you know what that means to me? Opportunity for future research. So while I looked at all found this relationship, what we haven't looked at is boundary conditions on that related to the autonomy of team formation.
Yes.
That's another paper that we then don't translate into.
So, and I think following up on what Shakilia and Ebony were saying about the need for interventions, perhaps, or at least this talk to be given to some of our TCC or other NIH collaborative research teams, do you think you might be developing interventions or or this talk is like the beginning of it, but then an exercise that a research team could, or a partnership, or a collaborative partnership could work with amongst themselves.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, through the CCTS, I'm going to be developing an actual course on team science that hopefully will be released maybe this fall. So I'll probably spend the summer prepping the course and then make that available this fall. I also do workshops like this all the time, all over campus. So whether it's in pediatrics or some of you probably familiar with the Pathways group, I've done a lot, probably 20, I guess, over the last year. So I'm always available if you call me to come in and maybe speak to your division. I'm totally open to coming in and collecting data. If you'd like for me to come in and collect data. So the other thing about that is my colleagues that are at other universities, all I have to do is tell them, hey guys, I have an opportunity to go and collect data. Like, really? Let's work on it. So yes, I'm totally open. You know, if we want to sit down and talk about maybe engagement where I can come in, we sit down and figure out what is it that you actually want to learn. We develop a survey design, get an IRB approved, study it, then hopefully start developing some interventions to enhance the effectiveness of our team science. Did you have a follow-up?
It was just, I took a project management course last fall, and one of the things that I came to know after taking that course was that certain government agencies right now have required that if your organization is going to get contracts from the federal government over a certain dollar amount, then it's an expectation that you have someone with project management expertise on this project. And so it seemed like that there is a recognition from the federal level that teams need to have certain expertise if they're going to manage millions of dollars of federal dollars. But from your expertise, do you know of any other groups that are requiring that if you're going to engage us for a contract, or if you want a grant from us, that you have to have certain expertise, or your team has to have gone through certain training, or any requirements like that maybe we could, I guess, transition over here in the work that we're doing at UAB, or even within particular divisions? Or do you even see that across the campus? Are there departments that are doing things like that we maybe just don't know about?
Mm-hmm. I think I do see, things where they encourage interdisciplinary collaboration, or this grant is going to be based on 2 or more scientists from different disciplines or from different departments or different universities that collaborate. I think the other thing that oftentimes is missed is when we think about patient-centered research and community-based research, essentially that patient or that community member has expertise. Oftentimes we don't value it. But that's the reason why we have community-based participatory research, is that instead of us as scientists developing the study design on campus, and then we come out and present it to the community partner and say, here's what we want to do to you, then why not bring that community-based partner, treat them as an actual full-fledged member of the scientific team, and have decision power at the beginning of the project. Same way for the patient, right? It's not just this paternalistic physician, I know what's best for the patient, and then I prescribe something. No, make the patient the center of their own care. So again, it's recognizing that, and I think some of these grant organizations are recognizing that we need citizen science, we need patient science, we need community science. I hope that kind of addresses your question in some way. My sense is this is going to be something that's going to be across all of the federal agencies as it relates to, we have a recognition that if we really want to speed bench to bedside translation and then into population health and global health, it's going to take a team-based approach. Well, I thank you guys for engaging. I really do appreciate it.
And I just want to remind everyone to complete the evaluation forms. And next month, on Thursday, March 3rd, Dr. Olivia Clay will be talking about using factor analysis to examine associations of multiple chronic conditions and pain among older adults with diabetes. So looking at the research methods for that. And in April, we have a workshop on Medicare data. So large data sets that Dr. Meredith Kilgore will be leading on Friday, April 29th. And then Thursday, May 5th, Dr. Virginia Howard is going to be talking about the REGARDS study and that secondary data set. So Dawn will be sending out emails. If you're not on the email list, write your email over here, but hopefully everyone here is here because they got the email about it. So be sure to sign in too if you haven't. So thank you all.